medicine meant that the best a patient could hope for was death. A lethal injection isn't a dignified death. Instead, it's a speedy way of dispatching elderly, disabled and other vulnerable patients who are usually struggling with all sorts of psychological pressures, anxieties and feelings of being a burden on their loved ones. Legalising euthanasia isn't merely a simple law change. Instead, legalising euthanasia completely changes the nature of what medicine is, meaning that healthcare professionals would now have the legal power to use lethal injections to terminate the lives of their patients. This change would reverse centuries of patient protections, leaving sick, elderly and infirm persons in a dangerously vulnerable position. Other countries that have already legalised euthanasia serve as a stark warning about the dangers of heading down this path. Belgium, for example, is now debating allowing euthanasia for young children and patients with Alzheimer's. To suggest that either of these two groups of people could ever give a proper, free and informed consent to being killed by lethal injection is simply ludicrous. And the Royal Dutch Medical Association of the Netherlands, where euthanasia has been legal even longer than in Belgium, is now proposing that euthanizing a sick person in order to alleviate the suffering of the family would be an acceptable thing to do. Yes, you did hear that correctly. Doctors in the Netherlands are now suggesting that ending your life with a lethal injection in order to make things easier for your family is a perfectly ethical thing. What these frightening examples prove is that when you make it legal for doctors to terminate the lives of their patients for one reason, it doesn't take long for the system to start finding lots of other reasons for doctors to end the lives of their patients as well. Legalising euthanasia isn't medicine, and it isn't safe for Kiwis. A dignified death is not found at the end of a lethal injection. It is found when patients are shown proper care and compassion, enabling them to end their lives with mana rather than with a fearful act of suicide.
I think that's all I want to say. Are there any questions, comments we want to... Yes.
Has there been any medical councils or groups in the Netherlands or in Belgium that have struggled with having their conscience protected, to say that they don't want to partake in acts of euthanasia?
There are individual groups who have mounted those sort of defences, but as far as I'm aware, there have been no doctors' associations or anything that have tried to mount that sort of defence.
Yeah.
In this country, the Medical Association in New Zealand has continued to maintain a firm no stance to euthanasia, in opposition to it. It came up for review again, I think about 6 years ago when it came up for review, last came up for review. And in some other jurisdictions they've gone to a neutral stance, but over here our doctors have been firm and they've said no.
But in Netherlands and Belgium, are they under obligation to respond to the request of somebody?
So what was the question?
Are they obligated to euthanize somebody?
I think they have to refer. I don't think they're obligated to end the life of the patient on the spot, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Put that in reverse. In the abortion cases in the UK, for instance, doctors and nurses that don't want to do an abortion are missing out on jobs, etc., and promotion, blah, blah, blah. And so it goes, and that's what will happen with euthanasia.
It's happening in New Zealand already. A very good friend of mine in this city. Very, very, I mean, she's a poster girl for medicine. Bright, good-looking, attractive young doctor, highly qualified. And she hasn't run down the halls of power screaming anti-abortion slogans or anything like that. She's just simply said, I will not be participating in any abortions in my particular specialty. So please do not ask me to do that. And as a result of that, she's found out subsequently that she's been passed over for 3 promotions purely because of that. Now that's illegal in New Zealand to do that. It's simply because of that 3 promotions already. So you can see how you're right, the same factors would have to come into play. Once again, it's human nature. We want people who support the system and support the ideology, not those who are going to be viewed as an inconvenience to it.
Been chatting recently with a friend of mine who's recently finished his psychology degree. And he's kind of immersed in the whole university world where everything's a rational argument, and it's all utilitarian. And he is even he's saying, well, yeah, I've still got my Catholic faith upbringing, but he's trying to be objective, looking at all the arguments and respecting that other people may not have the same views as him, And just in my thinking of that, it can be quite difficult to, how do you convey to people giving their rational arguments when, you know, they can say, well, you know, have you got any tips on how to deal with academic?
Well, the first thing I want to say to someone in that situation is, I think you want to start asking some questions about how rational is it really to have a change in our medical ethics so that patient killing is now a legitimate part of it. I would also want to start asking questions around, at what point does respect for ideas? We must always retain respect for persons, but some ideas are really dumb, very dangerous, and they don't deserve our respect. So if someone's promoting a really dangerous or bad or evil idea, to say, oh well, they're all it's just a whole slew of ideas out there, you're just different, I'm just different, the old relativism. Then I think it's a very dangerous thing, because what you end up with, Peter Kreeft, Catholic philosopher, is very good on this. He says what we're supposed to have is a hierarchy of ideas that leads to an equality of persons. So we reject certain ideas, like enslaving people of African descent is acceptable. We reject that idea outright, so that's really bad, that goes right down the bottom of the list. And as a result, we end up with this, in theory, as much as we can, an equality of persons. But what we've got is we've flipped that on the head, and often people in academia, you'll find, and that in your particular setting anyway, have said, well, we have an equality of ideas. The problem with an equality of ideas is the end result normally is in a hierarchy of persons. So some people end up further down the food chain without the same respects and rights as those further up, usually in a more powerful position. Because if you have an equality of ideas and you say every idea is equal, how do you determine right or wrong? The only way to really do that is by some sort of majority vote, and effectively what you're asking the strong to do is to decide what happens for the vulnerable. And it's interesting, he's a psychology major, did you say? Yeah, so that sort of relativism is very common in the social sciences. But you go into his academic philosophy department, you go into any academic philosophy department in a secular university, and you will find that the majority of them absolutely reject this sort of relativistic notion outright. Relativism is something that's looked down on because they can see the clear, obvious logical contradiction in it. Normally they embrace other approaches to things. One of the things I think that could be good to sort of engage with them on is actually putting before him, and I'm happy if you want to keep an email contact, some of the studies, there's plenty of them out there now, and the risk factors associated with this. Because often, as I said, when I'm discussing this with someone, all I'm looking for someone to actually say to me is, yeah, okay, I can see that's a risk. Because all of a sudden that's a shift, that's quite a monumental shift. And even if someone walks away and says, well, I still ethically think it's okay, I mean, I'd love it if they saw the truth of human dignity. But if they walk away saying, okay, well, I think it's ethically okay, but I think it's too risky to legalise it, I think that's a win, right? That's a win. Because it actually, the more people who think like that, ultimately the ultimate goal is for the majority of people to think and see the ethical part of this issue and see how this is so unethical. But the more people in our culture that even think, well, no, legalising is a really bad and dangerous idea, the better off for those vulnerable people in our community. But I would say begin to engage with them about the risk factors, the academic papers. Like I had a couple of them there, I know they flashed by, I apologise really quickly. 50% of cases in the Netherlands where they requested euthanasia, the people were suffering from clinical depression at the time they made the request. So how can that be a free and consented and sound mind decision? There's another study where they found that in the vast majority of circumstances, they were prescribing antidepressant medication for family members, not the sick person, but the family members to help them cope with the situation. And after having seen my own family situation in the last year, I can see why. I can see why and how that pressure gets brought to bear. And often people don't think about or see those other angles on the actual situation.
Having been involved in the battle against the abortion law reform and having watched how those who were for abortion went from the most extreme cases only to now shall we decriminalise it?
Yeah.
Have you charted or made a video clip or done anything that charts the shift in Holland and Belgium, showing the steps?
Yeah.
And is it available?
No, I haven't, but a good friend of mine, Paul Russell, who's a full-time anti-euthanasia campaigner based in Australia, and he's part of a network, he travels the world quite regularly. He's written articles on this, about some of these shifts, and even things like just recently, there's he's considered one of the leading lights of euthanasia, and he organised a tour of other pro-euthanasia doctors, and the tour, they went to Auschwitz to see Auschwitz in operation, and he's talking about this so they can better understand euthanasia in their own country. With this total disconnect about why people from the outside world would look at that and go, oh my gosh, what's gone wrong here? A doctor taking another group of doctors to Auschwitz to then unpack and encourage them how they could better streamline their system of euthanasia. So, and you can see how that's a massive shift from, just in extreme cases to that sort of thing. Now, Paul Russell, he's got a really good website, Hope, I think it's hope.org.au, and he regularly posts articles and studies and other things up there. But I can get in touch with Paul and see if I can get some information for you if you like. If you want to send me after, I'll give you an email address. But yeah, it's an issue. I mean, one of the things, I guess, the elephant in the room too, whenever this issue comes up, is once again the issue of what's happened in Nazi Germany. Now, please hear me. I'm not saying that anybody who holds a pro-euthanasia position is a Nazi, or that they are on side of the Nazis. What I'm saying is that you need to understand the historical context of what happened in Germany to see how dangerous this concept actually is. Now, what happens in Germany is, in Germany, they don't start with the Nazis. That's not the beginning of the problems in Germany. It starts well before the Nazis are even a reality as a party, a political entity. I think Hitler was about 18 years of age, in fact, when two German doctors, Hock and Leining, published this volume, A Life Devoid of Value, asking the question, are there some lives that are literally devoid of value? Now, Germany is considered the leading academic and the most enlightened sort of culture of the time. They are leaders in Europe. They are looked upon as leaders in the world in thought, and they produce this volume, Are Their Lives Devoid of Value? And this volume is so popular, it sells out in hardcover. It sells out 2 editions. And this thing begins to shape thought. Remember, there's no Nazi party at this point. It doesn't exist. This has already begun to shape people's thinking about human persons, that some lives are devoid of value. Then what happens is, of course, the Nazis come into power, and, of course, the expansion of this ideology just begins to set in, because they combine that particular ideology with their own anti-Semitic ideologies and their Aryan domination ideology and everything else, and you can see how, boom, you get this perfect storm and this great evil takes place. Now, what happens is the euthanasia program is happening in Germany. They are euthanizing persons with disability and Down syndrome. By all counts, the estimations are just over 200,000 persons with disabilities were killed by the Nazi euthanasia program. They weren't just euthanizing. There's a really good history site. I wish I could remember the link, but I often go back to it, and it's updated really as new scholarly information is available. And there's some tragic cases. There's one case recently has photographs of the woman who had who suffered from schizophrenia and was moved around. As another one who was diagnosed with mental illness just because she disagreed with the state and was a communist. So they diagnosed her, and then she ended up in the euthanasia ward, and they killed her, ended her life. And it's quite a horrific litany. But what happens is they stop the program at one point, and the father of a child with Down syndrome writes to Hitler and says, "Please, mein Führer, reinstate the program. What sort of life is my son going to live? He's got no dignity. We need this program back." So Hitler reinstates the program, and then what happens is the whole issue of the final solution for the Jewish problem starts to come on the table in Nazi Germany. And what they do is they just shift focus. This isn't just let's invent a whole new and murderous thing out of nowhere, killing Jews and creating gas ovens and concentration camps and everything else. They take the systems and the mechanisms that were designed for the euthanasia program, which were killing persons with disabilities. The gas oven was invented for the euthanasia program. They simply shift it into the genocide of the Jews. The crematoria, once again, designed for the euthanasia program. They shift that in, and most of the staff who were part of the euthanasia program just took up jobs in the genocide program that they ran. And it's a rather inconvenient and very uncomfortable truth. I posted an article on my blog, actually, earlier this year, a couple of months ago, with about 7 or 8 photographs that should make us very uncomfortable about that period. And one of the photographs shows all of these staff, these German staff, at a party who are part of the euthanasia program, and they've got the old accordion out, and they're drinking, and they look like ordinary, normal people that you would probably socialise them with. Yeah, they're great. They didn't have horns, big red eyes or anything, and you realise when you look at that photo, my gosh, this is how simply and quickly Hannah Arendt, the journalist who covered Adolf Eichmann's trial, coined the phrase, the banality of evil. She said when she went to see him in the dock, she was asked to write a paper about it. write articles about it, and she expected to see a monster. And she saw this frail little old man, and she said this was the banality of evil right in front of her. It was just ordinary and mundane. And this is exactly what you get in this euthanasia program. It's mundane, it's ordinary, it's actually very normal, and that's what makes it so frightening. When the movie Downfall came out in Germany, which is probably one of the best films of German films certainly I've ever seen, probably one of the best war films, about the final days of Hitler in the bunker, based on the memoirs. There was criticism in Germany at the time. They said, you've made him into too much of an ordinary person. He's a monster. And the director said, that's the whole point. You know, he's not. He doesn't come across as level-headed. If you watch the movie, it's but he's certainly. The director's still trying to make this point. This could happen at any point again, because what's happening here is there's a whole lot of evil ideologies that form and underpin, and other things at play, which lead to this evil situation. He's not some barbaric monster who's so anti-human it could never ever happen again. That's the point. And the same is true, I think, with this euthanasia program. Now, I'm not saying legalise euthanasia, you end up with another Holocaust. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is legalise euthanasia, that is the thing that changes the way. There's a friend of mine, a lady I met, very qualified nurse, and now got postgraduate degrees in other areas as well. I met her in Melbourne a couple of years ago, and she presented a very interesting paper about the role that nurses played in the Third Reich and the atrocities. Now a lot of the doctors went on trial. None of the nurses ever went on trial for what they did. And actually, she said, when you do the study, you look at it, the nurses were often far more complicit and involved in what was going on than the doctors were. So you can see how this thing shapes the whole medical establishment, in a very dangerous way. Anybody else want to add? Yes.
Do any of the promoters of abortion lead by example, or is it just for
euthanasia?
Yeah.
And where we go first? There was. I remember someone once saying to me, there is, and he's still around. This guy promotes this movement. He's got a few members, not huge, of a voluntary mass extinction of all human beings to save the planet and the environment. We shall kill ourselves. As a friend of mine said, well, you go first. Trust me, we're following. But no, you don't generally, and it's interesting too, another paper I heard at that same conference in Melbourne was presented by a female lawyer, and she'd studied the modern cases of euthanasia. And we saw this again actually with the case of the woman who was originally in Auckland, who's now in Canada. I remember her a couple of weeks ago, who committed suicide, and there's this terrible article in the Herald basically effectively, I think, glamorising that act, which is extremely dangerous. But anyway, this academic that I heard present a couple of years ago in Melbourne had gone back and studied the modern cases like that, the big cases and the cases that have made headlines. And it's interesting, she said there's a trend. Almost all of them were women who were the euthanasia victims, and they were certain, she basically defined it down and said they had certain common characteristics. A lot of them were middle-aged, a lot of them were of a certain era in how they viewed their responsibility and role to the family, and there was a husband involved, and she basically said you can effectively chart a clear path and pattern of obligation. There's an obligation to die, and she'd actually presented what I thought was a very interesting argument. I don't know how it would go down in feminist circles, but she presented an argument for how euthanasia, from major cases, actually presented a real risk to authentic feminism, because it was women who were often the victims when they began to feel the obligation that they were now a burden on their family, and they had to be the providers of care for everyone, and the nurturers. When they couldn't do that anymore, they must end their lives, because that, very, very interesting paper. Yeah. I think it's us. Yes, I am. I mean, I think the biggest thing we can do, and I just, let me finish, is that all right if I finish with just a couple of practical bits of advice, so how to talk with people about this, whether it's a politician or on talkback or having a conversation with people. I think just a couple of little tips. I think the first thing is it's important to listen to what people are actually saying. Don't just start straight away with a whole lot of, don't go straight to the Nazi euthanasia analogy. So listen to what they're saying and hear what they're saying, and then respond to what they're actually saying. So if it's coming from a place of their own personal fear, address that. And begin to talk them through, well, how realistic are those fears? How many things that you are fearful of and worry about in life actually come true? I saw one study, I don't know how you gauge this. It's kind of like the goldfish memory study. They reckon goldfish have a 3-second memory. I've always asked myself, how do they know that? Right? They hold up a card. Do you remember this? 2 seconds later, do you remember? Yes, I do. 3 seconds, no. So, but the study suggested that 4 out of the 5 things we worry about don't actually happen. So you can see how fear is often. So if someone's responding from a place of fear, begin to engage with them at that level. Don't try and bring out the Nazi story because you think that's a really good one. I heard that the other night. I'll bring that one out because that might just go right over the top of your head. Listen to what they're actually saying and respond to that. Allow people the right to their view. Even if their view is, as I said, is a dangerous one, you're not going to get anywhere if you treat them like they're idiots and they don't have any dignity and they're not allowed to think for themselves, and if they just thought like you, we wouldn't be at a place. Okay? So that's a real problematic way of approaching it. Be clear, consistent, concise, coherent, and have conviction. If you're going to communicate well with people, you've got to be clear about what it is you're saying. You've got to be consistent in your message, I think. You've got to be concise. So if they walk away from a conversation with you thinking, man, I need to go and find myself a medical dictionary just to unpack this thing, then, there's a great possibility it hasn't really been as effective as it could have been. Be coherent in the way that you explain yourself to. And lastly, I think people need to see there's a sense of conviction, that you believe this is real. Why should I believe this is an issue and this is real? Unless you don't, unless if your body language, the way you talk about it, doesn't suggest to me that, there is some conviction in what you're saying here, that there is something more here to be considered. Don't mix your issues. This is particularly important if you're going to talk to MPs about this issue. Go in and see them about the issue of euthanasia. Don't take 2 or 3 different issues all at once with you. If you're going to ring up talkback, don't talk about 2 or 3 different issues. If you want to ring up talk about euthanasia, just talk about that issue and do it well. Be careful of religious arguments. Now, when you're in a religious context, like someone sent me a paper recently, it was written in the Presbyterian newspaper in New Zealand. Presbyterian ministers arguing how a Christian case for legalised euthanasia and how it was perfectly acceptable in God's eyes to commit suicide and give yourself back to Him, which was absolutely astounding, I thought, as a view. But anyway, so that's a time for a debate. It's a religious debate, and I think we really tackle that. But a lot of people don't come at this issue from a religious perspective, and I think one of the most effective